The morning Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore disappeared, the house on Ashford Lane was unnaturally silent. No footsteps echoed through its long corridors. No orders were shouted from behind closed doors. Even the birds seemed to avoid the place, as if something inside had disturbed the natural order of things. By noon, whispers had already begun to spread across Richmond. A wealthy widow does not simply vanish. Mrs. Whitmore was known throughout the town, not for kindness, but for control. She carried herself with cold authority, her sharp gaze enough to silence a room. Few dared to question her, and even fewer were ever invited inside her grand home. The house itself stood like a monument to isolation. Tall, elegant, and always shut tight against the outside world. And inside that world lived Clara Hensley, 19 years old, quiet, obedient, almost invisible. She had arrived in Richmond only months before, hired without references, without history. To the neighbors, she was little more than a shadow moving behind curtains. Some said they had never even heard her voice. But they had heard other things. Late at night, when the streets fell silent, strange sounds came from the Whitmore house. Low voices, sharp arguments, the sudden crash of something heavy hitting the floor. Then, nothing. The next morning, Clara would appear as usual, calm, composed, and expressionless, as if the night had never happened. On the day Mrs. Whitmore vanished, it was Clara who opened the door. She stood there, quietly, hands folded, her face pale but steady. "She's gone," she said. No panic, no fear. Just those two words. Gone. Inside the house, everything seemed untouched, too perfect, too still. As if time itself had paused in that moment. But something felt wrong, because people don't just disappear, and houses don't fall silent without reason. So the question began to grow, slowly, quietly, like a shadow creeping across the walls. What really happened inside that house the night before? The first thing the officer noticed was the heat. Not from the fireplace, not from the morning sun. It was coming from the kitchen. As the authorities stepped deeper into the Whitmore house, a heavy stillness followed them. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding on to something they refused to release. And in the center of it all stood Clara Hensley, calm, composed, and watching. Too composed. She repeated her story without hesitation. Mrs. Whitmore had left before dawn. No argument, no warning, just gone. Her voice was steady, her expression empty, as if she had rehearsed every word. But something didn't match. There were no signs of travel, no packed belongings, no carriage tracks outside. Even Mrs. Whitmore's favorite coat still hung by the door. It was as if she had never planned to leave at all. The officers began to search the house more carefully. Every room was in perfect order, beds made, furniture polished, not a single thing out of place. It didn't feel like a home. It felt staged. Then they entered the kitchen. The smell hit them first, faint but unmistakably unpleasant. On the stove sat a large iron pot. Its surface was darkened from heavy use, and beneath it the metal still held warmth. One officer reached out, hesitating for a moment before touching it. Still warm. Clara noticed. "I made broth," she said quickly, her voice cutting through the silence. But there were no vegetables, no scraps, no signs of cooking anywhere nearby. Just the pot, and that smell. One of the officers leaned closer, his face tightening as he examined the rim. There was something there,
a thin, greasy residue that didn't look like food. Behind him, Clara stood perfectly still, watching, waiting. And in that moment, a quiet but terrifying thought began to take shape in the officer's mind. What exactly had been boiling in that pot?
The moment the lid was lifted, everything changed. A thick, sour smell rushed into the air, heavy, unnatural, and impossible to ignore. One of the officers instinctively stepped back, covering his nose, while the other leaned closer, forcing himself to look inside. At first, it was just dark liquid, thick, cloudy. Then he saw it. Something pale resting at the bottom. Not bone-white like porcelain, but dull, uneven, organic. He froze. Carefully, using a metal utensil, he stirred the contents. The liquid shifted, revealing more fragments, small, irregular pieces that no one in that room could mistake for anything else. They weren't food. They were human. The silence that followed was suffocating. Behind them, Clara stood motionless, no gasp, no denial, not even surprise. Her face remained eerily calm, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. The officers moved quickly now. The kitchen was no longer just a room, it was a crime scene. They searched every corner, every surface, and with each passing minute the truth grew darker. Tiny fragments were found stuck along the edges of the pot. Grease-like residue coated the stove. The smell, once faint, now seemed to seep from the walls themselves. This hadn't been an accident. It had been deliberate, careful, planned. One officer turned slowly toward Clara, his voice low but firm. "Where is Mrs. Whitmore?" For the first time, something shifted in her expression, not fear, but strain, as if a crack had formed beneath her calm exterior. She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the pot, then back to the officer. And in that silent exchange, the unspoken truth became impossible to ignore. Mrs. Whitmore had never left the house. She had been here all along. The officer took a step closer, his voice sharper now. "What did you do?" Clara's lips parted slightly, her composure beginning to unravel. And then she finally spoke. "I didn't mean to kill her." The words came out softly, but they echoed through the kitchen like a confession carved in stone. Clara's voice trembled, not with panic, but with something deeper, something buried. Her eyes, once empty, now carried a weight that had clearly been building for a long time. The officers said nothing. They let her speak. At first, her story came in fragments, broken sentences, hesitation. But slowly, the pieces began to form a darker picture of life inside the Whitmore house. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore was not the quiet, respectable widow the town believed her to be. Behind closed doors, she was controlling, unpredictable, and cruel. Clara described endless hours of work with no rest, meals taken in silence, doors locked from the outside, punishments for the smallest mistakes, sometimes verbal, sometimes worse. The grand house that looked so elegant from the outside had been for her a prison. But then Clara revealed something even more disturbing. She had found things, hidden bottles, strange powders, locked drawers that Mrs. Whitmore guarded obsessively. At night, Clara claimed she would hear her mistress moving through the house, whispering to herself, mixing substances in the kitchen long after midnight. Something was wrong. And when Clara finally confronted her, when she threatened to tell someone, everything changed.
The argument that followed was violent. Her breathing grew heavier as she described it. The shouting, the anger, the sudden movement. Mrs. Whitmore grabbing something, stepping closer. "I thought she was going to kill me," Clara whispered. In that moment, fear took over. She reached for the nearest object, an iron tool, and struck. Once. Mrs. Whitmore collapsed instantly. Silence. Clara stared at the floor for what felt like hours. No movement, no breath, just stillness. That's when panic set in. Not grief, not regret. Panic. Her voice lowered as she spoke the next part, almost as if she couldn't believe it herself. "I had to make it disappear." The officers exchanged a glance, the weight of her words sinking in. But one question still lingered, sharp and unresolved. Was Clara telling the truth, or was this carefully crafted story hiding something far more sinister?
The truth should have ended the case, but instead, it made everything darker. As Clara's confessions spread through Richmond, the town reacted with shock and confusion. Some believed her instantly, convinced that no young girl could invent such a detailed story of fear and survival. Others saw something else in her calm, measured words, something rehearsed. Investigators returned to the house, this time searching not for a body, but for answers. If Clara's story was true, there had to be proof, something that could explain the hidden bottles, the late-night whispers, the life she claimed to have endured. What they found only deepened the mystery. Locked away in Mrs. Whitmore's private room were letters, dozens of them. Some were unsigned. Others contained names that meant nothing to the officers, but the contents were disturbing. References to money, illness, sudden deaths, and in between the lines, something darker, something deliberate. There were also small glass vials, carefully sealed and hidden. Inside them, traces of unknown substances clung to the glass. It was enough to raise questions, but not enough to prove anything. The court case that followed divided the town. Clara stood quietly as the evidence was presented, her expression unreadable. She did not deny what she had done, but she never changed her story either. Self-defense, fear, survival. In the end, the court reached its decision. Guilty, but not beyond mercy. Her sentence spared her life, but not her freedom. And still, doubts remained. Years later, those who visited the prison spoke of Clara in hushed tones. They said she rarely spoke, that she spent hours sitting in silence as if lost in thought. But sometimes, only sometimes, they claimed she would smile, not with relief, not with regret, but with something far more unsettling. Because even now, one question refuses to fade into history. Did Clara Hensley reveal the truth that night, or did she carefully choose which parts to hide? If this story left you questioning what really happened inside that house, then you're not alone. Do you think Clara was telling the truth, or was it all a carefully planned lie? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you enjoyed dark, mysterious, true crime stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next case, because some secrets are still waiting to be uncovered.